Praise God. Greetings to all of you once again in the matchless name of our Lord and our Savior, Jesus Christ. God has kept us back in the land of the living once again to come to God's presence and listen His blessed word. As we are in God's presence, may it be that the Lord would specially speak to each one of us. I have given a homework today morning. I don't know how many of you have gone through that. I saw some hands up. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand anyway, those who have already read. I hope some of you at least might have read the portion. Do you remember the portion? I said it is Exodus chapter 3. I've been reminded of an incident that happened in one of the churches. The pastor announced that he will be taking a special subject next week. So all of them were asked to read Mark chapter 17. And next week when they came, he asked the audience to raise their hands, those who have already read the chapter. Many who did not do that, they don't want to be humiliated knowing others that they could not read it. So they raised their hand to show that they read it. And then the pastor said, okay, my topic is truthfulness, because there is no 17th chapter in Mark's book. Well, I hope all of you are truthful and you might have gone through the passage. Okay, let's come back to our topic. We have come to the 6th class of our study from Egypt to Canaan. So far we have seen that God requires a leader to bring out the people from the bondage and slavery under the Pharaoh. And also we saw the leader is prepared by God. How God was preparing his leader to be capable of bringing out the people from the slavery and lead them to the promised land, Canaan. We also looked to some of the initial failures of the leader. We saw that the leader tried to commence his mission before his call. Then we saw how he was dealing with partiality. And again, we saw last week how he was trying to accomplish the mission of God by his physical strength, by his self. And these were the things that we have looked to during the past weeks. And we will look to the fourth failure of the leader. That is, he was not ready in God's time. That was the fourth failure we can see in the life of God's leader. We will look to a wide portion, but we are not going to read the whole portion. It may take much time. So we look to Exodus chapter 4, verses 10 through 13. Now probably you may be thinking that I asked you to read Exodus chapter 3 and now I'm reading Exodus chapter 4. Okay, we will look to this portion but come back to Exodus chapter 3. We will not get time to read the whole passage, and that's why I have given it as a homework to read it so that it will be easy for you to follow me when I refer to some of the verses in that chapter. Well, we will look to Exodus chapter 4, verses 10 through 13. When Moses said to the Lord, "Please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither recently nor in past time, nor since you have spoken to your servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." But the Lord said to him, "Who has made the human mouth? Or who makes anyone unable to speak or deaf or able to see or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now then go, and I myself will be with you with your mouth, and instruct you in what you are to say." But he said, "Please, Lord, now send the message by whomever you will." So the Lord was assigning Moses to accomplish his purpose of redeeming people from the land of Egypt. Now Moses was not ready to do that. He was putting forth his own excuses. In chapter 3 of Exodus, we see God appearing to Moses while he was pasturing the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. Well, in the initial classes, we saw in Acts chapter 7, verse 23, that Moses was 40 years when he came out from the palace to help his people. We have seen that not very long, probably within a couple of days itself, he had to flee to Midian when he came to know that the news of killing the Egyptian is being spread out. In Exodus chapter 7, verse 7, we read that Moses was 80 years old when he came and spoke to Pharaoh about the delivering people of Israel from the slavery of Egypt. So it was at the age of 40 that he went to Midian, he fled to Midian, and now at the age of 80, he came back, which means Moses had now spent already 40 years tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law. I'll show you an interesting calculation. We saw earlier in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, that the Lord told Abraham, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in the land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. When we come to Exodus chapter 12, verse 41, it speaks about their departure, their exodus. There it says that at the end of 430 years, on this very day, all the multitude of the Lord departed from the land of Egypt." Now, compare these two verses. To Abraham, we see that the Lord has very clearly told him that his descendants will be slaves in the foreign country as strangers in another country for 400 years. Now, in Exodus 12:41, we see that the time when they departed, the exodus started, it had already completed 430 years. What does it mean? Did God make a mistake in calculation? We can derive a couple of explanations for this difference. I'll say at least 2 or 3, and then I'll come to what I actually believe and think which is more proper. Some people interpret it as that God is not telling the exact year. God was telling a round figure of 400 years, but it actually went up to 430. That is one explanation. Then there was another explanation that they say they were strangers in another land, but the Lord specifically told that they'll be under slavery and oppression for 400 years. So they will conclude that even though they stayed there for 130 years, initial 30 years they were not slaves, they had the freedom, they were treated as guests, and later they became slaves there. So that time period is counted as 400 years of slavery, and total 430 years. So the difference 30 years is because they were not considered as slaves in the initial 30 years when they were there, brought to the land of Egypt as the family of Joseph, who was the second to the Pharaoh, the ruler of the country. Well, I personally do not agree with that, and that above explanation did not actually go with the actual time period. And also I am not feeling comfortable about the explanation. Now, our God is a God who is omniscient. He knows everything. He knows the very end before the beginning. So he need not have to give an approximate time. He can give the exact year, exact month, exact day, and even exact time. He can give that because he is omniscient God. He is all-knowing God. He need not have to approximate. It is for human beings who did not know things very properly. They approximate things. They round up things because they may not be able to exactly say what it is. But for God, it is not like that. He did not want to approximate. He can tell the exact time. So the first explanation, God was giving an approximate time period, I do not agree with. Now, second explanation, if we read Genesis chapter 41 and verse 46, we can see that Joseph was 30 years old when he was brought to the palace of Pharaoh and was appointed as the second to Pharaoh to administer the financial aspect of the country. Since Pharaoh had a dream and Joseph explained the dream. So according to the dream, we know that there would be 7 years of plenteousness in the land of Egypt, and afterwards there would be 7 years of dearth or 7 years of famine. That was the meaning of the dream that Pharaoh had seen, which Joseph rightly explained to him. Then there was 7 years of plenteousness when Joseph was in charge of gathering all the corns and arranging it in the barn house. After 7 years, the dearth or the drought or the famine started. So he was 37 when the famine started, and probably we see when the brothers of Joseph came to Egypt to collect corn or collect food from there, probably it would be another couple of years, because initial years they would have their own resources, and once that famine has spread all over the world, that's what we read there. Then Jacob sent his sons to Egypt to collect the foodstuff, collect the corns. That's what we read there. So it can be after another 2-3 years probably. That means Joseph was by the time 39 or 40 years old. In Genesis chapter 50 and verse 22, we can see that Joseph died at the age of 110. That means if his father has met him or his whole family was brought to Egypt when he was 40, that means he spent time with them for at least 70 years. So this 30 years difference will not match there. Even his family and his parents were there for 70 years with him. Okay, later he died. Now, Exodus chapter 1 and verse 5 says that they were only 70 people, the family of Joseph, who came from Canaan to the land of Egypt. Okay, so Joseph was there for 70 years. Okay, later he died. But when you come to Exodus chapter 1 and verse 7, first chapter of Exodus, we see it says, "But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them." Okay, in 30 years or in 70 years when Joseph was there, this 70 people will not be multiplied and fill the land all of a sudden. It takes time. Okay, so there was a time period that they were translated, they were changed from the people who were considered as royal guests of Pharaoh to people who were afraid by the natives, who started to torture them, started to subdue them and make them as the slaves to avoid any rebellion against the Pharaoh, against the king. That was the intention. So that 30 years of difference, they were treated as guests, or they had good time in Egypt, did not match. And we can know that at least they were well treated in Egypt for more than 100 years, for even I think for another 150 or 200 years, that they became a great multitude, and later they started torturing and subduing them, making them slaves, so that they could not come out as a force to rebel against the Pharaoh. That was the intention. So we see here, the Lord said, for they'll be strangers in another country for 400 years. Now, the actual record says that they were there for 430 years. That means there is a difference of 30 years. The two explanations that was there, I did not agree with. I think it is not appropriate. It didn't match with the actual situation. So there could be some other explanation for that 30 years of difference. Okay. I personally agree with another thinking or another explanation that says this 30 years difference happened because Moses, the leader of God to bring the people out from Egypt, was not ready. That means this 30 years of extension happened because Moses was ready to bring out the people from the land of Egypt. I personally agree with that suggestion. I think it is more appropriate. Well, we saw how Moses was trained. Okay, earlier days he was in his own house. We can think it can span up a time period of 10 to 15 years. Okay, his early stage. We saw that when we look to the other classes. Well, he might have been at his home for 10 to 15 years to have the early spiritual training. Then he was moved to the palace. That means if you think he was moved to the palace at the age of 10 or 15, rest of the years till 40, that means 25 to 30 years, he was there at the palace having secular training. Okay. Now from there, he fled to the house of Jethro because of the problem that has come because of killing of the Egyptian. Now, if Moses had spent only 10 years in the house of Jethro and would have come out to save the people, deliver the people from Egypt, the time that the Lord said initially, 400 years, would have matched. Understand? So we can think that God's plan for the training of his leader, the third stage of his training at the house of Jethro, his emotional and intellectual training, the third stage of emotional training that he wanted to get there was to be for the period of 10 years. If he was prepared within that 10 years, then God could have accomplished his word. God could have delivered his people at exactly 400 years of their exile. But unfortunately, we can see that the leader was not ready, so it extended for another 30 years. It came to 430 years. Okay, I'm sure you may have a very relevant question in your mind, or maybe one or two questions in your mind. If that is the case, why we did not see that God appeared to Moses earlier, and why he did not ask him to go to Pharaoh and deliver him? We do not have the record of God appearing to him after 10 years and asking him to go and deliver the people from the Egypt. Why the Lord appeared to Moses only at this period of time? Okay, that could be a question, as a very relevant question can be. If I say that God's initial plan was only 10 years for Moses to spend with Jethro or in his father-in-law's house, then why didn't God appear to him after that 10 year and ask him to leave the place, go and bring out the people from Egypt? Yes, it's true that God did not appear to him. We do not have any record of God appeared to Moses earlier than that. The first record that we see God appeared to Moses is after 40 years, which means already 30 years of extension has happened. Why God did not appear to him earlier? I believe that Moses was not ready. That's why God did not appear to him. Even after this 40 years, we see when God had dialogue with him, the whole chapter of 3 of Exodus, then coming to chapter 4, and by the end of that, the verses that we read now, God explaining all these things. And finally, he come to a conclusion, Moses come to a conclusion that, okay, whatever you said is right, but it is better that you somebody else whom you like and to get the people delivered and leave me alone. That was his answer. Even after the 40th year, this was his attitude. So what his attitude would have been if God has appeared to him after 10 years? Right? God knew it. God is an omniscient God. God knew it. And that's why God did not appear. Rather, God allowed the people to stay back in the country of Egypt for another 30 years until Moses was prepared. Okay? So that was the suitable explanation, I believe, for this difference of 30 years with regard to the people with the stay of people in the land of Egypt. So we can derive the first lesson for today from there. In spite of our knowledge and ability concerning the will of God in our life, God can accomplish it through us only when we are prepared to be assigned for it. Read it carefully. Try to understand it well. In spite of our knowledge and ability concerning the will of God in our life, we know God's will in our life. We know God has a plan in our life. For Moses, he very well knew that God has a plan in his life to help out his people, to bring them out from the land of Egypt. He knew it very well. Right from his home, he had the training. Even after he's spending 25 to 30 years in the palace, still he came out to help out the people, knowing that his mission is not to become the next Pharaoh, but his mission is to help out the people, lead the people from that bondage and to the land of Canaan. He knew it very well. In spite of that knowledge, in spite of the capability, in spite of the training that God has imparted to Moses, God could not have assigned the mission because he was not fully prepared. Understand? Moses was not fully prepared, so God could not assign his mission, even though in the initial plan, Moses would have been trained within 10 years, the time that he spent in the house of Jethro, his father-in-law. Okay, so we should know this lesson in our life. In spite of our knowledge and ability concerning the will of God in our life, the will of God is revealed to us. We understood it. We know that this is God's will in my life. But still, God cannot accomplish it through us unless we are prepared before God to be assigned for that. God cannot entrust us that mission until we are prepared before the Lord. Okay, so we should be very careful about that, knowing the will of God, knowing that we have the ability, knowing that we have the grace of God, the spiritual gift. In spite of having all those things, if we are not prepared before God to be assigned for the mission, God cannot accomplish his will in our life. It will be delayed. This is what exactly happened in the life of Moses. Okay, it was God's initial plan to train him 10 years in the house of Jethro, his father-in-law. But Moses did not pass out in 10 years. It took him 20 years, 30 years, now it became 40 years, but still he is not completely equipped. He is not completely trained. No, the initial period was 10 years, but it is prolonged. No, it's like some courses we can say. One person can complete MBBS medicine in 4 years. That is the minimum course period for becoming a doctor, MBBS. But we know there are some students who would take 5 years, 10 years, 15 years to pass out. Right? So the actual time that is required for passing out, preparation, depends on the person, even though the minimum requirement is 5 years. Just like that, God's plan for Moses to be trained in the house of Jethro was 10 years, but Moses was not prepared. He did not learn his lesson well to be passed out within that 10 years. It is prolonged. He failed 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and now it is 40 years. Still not able to get the pass mark. Still he is afraid. Okay. So this is the first lesson. In spite of our knowledge and ability concerning the will of God in our life, God can accomplish it through us only when we are prepared to be assigned for it. We should have our preparation. We should stand before God so that God can use us. God can assign the mission to us to be accomplished in our life. Well, God may lead us through different situations to train us, to make us capable to equip us to assign his mission. But are we able to learn the lesson within the time period that God has specified? Are we able to understand? Are we able to accept God's plan? Are we able to correct ourselves? Are we able to dedicate ourselves? Are we able to be restored in God's presence that God would use us in his time? Many a times we delay a lot because of our own slothfulness, our own indifference, our own lack of dedication. As I usually say, God has a wonderful plan concerning us. And that's why God has purchased us from the penalty of sin by paying such a great price, even the life of his beloved Son, Lord Jesus Christ, at the cross of Calvary. God has a wonderful plan concerning each one of us. That's why we are bought with such great price. But still, God cannot accomplish that in our life if we are not ready, if we are not prepared, if we are not equipped thoroughly so that God can assign us that will to be accomplished according to the plan and purpose of God. So God may allow us to pass through difficult situations, preparing us and making us capable, ready to fulfill his plan. So it's our responsibility to learn our lessons. It's our responsibility to learn our lessons in God's time that we may be used by God in accomplishing God's will concerning us. Even we can know that if we delay in getting prepared, God's plan in our life also may be delayed. You understand? If we delay in getting prepared, if we delay in getting equipped to entrust God's mission, God's plan in our life also may be delayed. In chapter 3 of Exodus, we see God appearing to Moses in burning bush. Verse 1 and 2 of chapter 3. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Verse 2. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. So there we see God appeared to Moses at Horeb, the mountain of God. Well, that verse says that he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb. That phrase, west side of the wilderness, can be also translated as to the backside of the wilderness, or it can also be translated as beyond the wilderness. Okay, so I like that rendering more suitable. Moses led the flock beyond the wilderness. He led them beyond the wilderness, and now he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. Well, Moses was engaged in pasturing the flock of his father-in-law, and over these 40 years, he was tending the sheep in different places and different pastures. Okay? Now it is specifically told that he went beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. So probably God did not appear to him prior to this period, because even though all these 40 years he was pasturing the sheep in all those areas in and around that wilderness, but he never ventured to the mountain of God. He never proceeded to Horeb, the mountain of God. So it is mentioned that at this point of time, he went beyond the wilderness and reached mountain of God, Horeb. Probably this would be the first time that he led his sheep, his flock, to that particular place, to that extent. All these years he was not venturing to that area. he just avoided that area. Now he went all the way up to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now there we see God appeared to him. Now it was God's purpose that his leader should be trained in this wilderness for some time. As I mentioned earlier, his initial plan was that he would pasture the sheep. He would shepherd the sheep for 10 years in this wilderness so that he will get a training to shepherd the people of God through wilderness all this time. Okay? But all these 40 years, he was doing the business of his father-in-law, but never bothered to go up to Horeb, the mountain of God. But now, he went there and we see God appeared to him. So, he delayed the mission of God. He delayed the appearance of God because he was not venturing to go to the mountain of God, Horeb. His assignment was delayed because he did not yet go to the mountain of God. Now he ventured to the mountain of God, Horeb, where we see God appeared to him. Now we have the second lesson there. Our failure to go to God's presence will delay the accomplishment of God's will in our life. Okay? Our failure to go to God's presence will delay the accomplishment of God's will in our life. God has allowed some training in the life of Moses, but he was not ready to go to God's presence. He was wandering all around the wilderness, but never bothered to go to God's presence. So, God did not appear to him. Okay? This is a true fact with regard to our life also. God allows some training in our life to equip us for accomplishing his will in our life. It may be a tough time. It may be a time of difficulty and hardship. It may be time of pain and suffering and sickness. But are we able to go to God's presence with it, or we try to wander around in this world to find your own solution and remedy? This is the question. Okay? Let's take our present situation and compare it with this reality. We know the present pandemic situation that we are passing through. It is God who allowed it. It has happened by the knowledge of God. It is God who allowed this pandemic situation in our life. We get a lot of instructions from the medical personnels. No, we have a protocol from government authorities, and we have our own care and protection against the attack of the virus. Well, we need to pay attention to all these things, that's sure. But are we confined? Are we restrict ourselves within these trainings or these formalities only? Or are we going beyond this to the Lord's presence to know and understand God's plan and purpose concerning this issue in my life? If we are not going beyond all these limitations, all these protocols, all these medical informations, all this self-care that we take to protect us from the attack of virus, we are also like Moses, who was wandering around the wilderness for 40 prolonged years, not venturing to go to the mountain of God, Horeb. Do we spend time with God's presence? Do we really want to know God's plan and purpose concerning this pandemic? Why did God allow this pandemic? What is God's plan concerning me in this particular situation God has allowed in our life? The rectification and restoration that is needed in my life. How much time you spent in God's presence, listening His voice concerning this situation, to know the will of God and how to conduct yourself in this difficult time. If we spend time before God, if we are concerned about knowing the will of God concerning our life while we pass through this difficult situation, we sit in God's presence and try to understand His plan and purpose, then we are like Moses going beyond the wilderness to the mountain of Horeb, the mountain of God. There, I'm sure, God will appear and God will reveal His plan and purpose. If only we go beyond the wilderness, if only we go beyond all our physical arrangements, all our social arrangements, all our governmental arrangements or medical arrangements, if we go beyond that to God's presence, there we see God speaking to us, God revealing His plan and purpose concerning us. Let's go beyond the wilderness. Let's proceed to Horeb, the mountain of God. Let's go to the presence of God and wait upon God to know God's plan and purpose concerning the life of each one of us, as God allowed us to pass through this difficult pandemic situation. Even we were remembering in prayers that a couple of our dear ones were called home even today also, many in the past, and how many we don't know in the near future, in the coming days. Our responsibility is to go to God's presence and know His purpose. If we fail to know that, God will not accomplish His plan concerning you when He allowed this pandemic situation in your life. If we fail to go to God's presence and seek His guidance, know His plan concerning us as He allowed us to pass through these difficult situations, God's will concerning us will not be revealed to us. Well, another thing we can note here is the excuses Moses putting forth to avoid God's purpose. Exodus chapter 4, verse 10, there Moses says, "Please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past, nor since you have spoken your servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." So Moses was putting forth or presenting his limitation, his excuses to avoid God's purpose in his life. He says that he is slow of speech and slow of tongue. We know Moses was a person who was trained in all wisdom and knowledge and martial art of Egypt. Probably he might not have been an eloquent speaker by nature. That may be true. In some versions, it says that he was never an eloquent speaker, but in some, he says he was not eloquent previously or now. That means it speaks about a time period. Well, we don't know. Maybe he was not an eloquent speaker. He was not an orator. That was a special gift. He was not gifted with that gift, probably. But he was not slow to speak, or he was not a person of slow speech or slow tongue. I would say this was something that was acquired by him. That was a deficiency that he acquired over these 40 years, and this is not a deficiency that he got as inborn deficiency. You understand me? He was not an eloquent speaker. He was not an eloquent orator. That may be his inborn deficiency or a natural deficiency. But this slow of speech and slow of tongue, I believe it was not an inborn deficiency. It was an acquired deficiency. Well, I will just explain it and conclude today's class. Something interesting also, you can listen me. You know, the general study proves that women utter an average of 20,000 words per day, while men speak an average of only 7,000 words a day. Are you hearing me? It's a general study, it's a proven study that says generally women speak 20,000 words a day, while men speak only 7,000, an average of 7,000 words a day. Okay? That is the general statistics. Now, think about Moses. He was staying in his wife's house. He was staying with his father-in-law. Therefore, Moses would not be even using that much words. His speak probably reduced to half, because for a person who stays in wife's house did not have much voice, isn't it? So we can say that for Moses, he may be using even half a number of average words per day. So it can be 3,500 or so. Again, he was looking after his father's sheep. He was tendering the flock of his father-in-law. That means most of the time he will be out with the flock. He spends very less time at home. So while in the field with the flock, he did not want to use any words. He just makes some special noises just to attract or just to manage the sheep. That's all what he needs to do while he is tendering his sheep. Okay? So being out in the field, he may not be using even half of that average he might have used while he would have been in the house of his wife. Okay? So that means he may be using around an average of less than 1,000 words per day. Okay? That would have been his average word usage. Well, God allowed 10 years for him to stay at the house of Jethro, his father-in-law, to control his speech, okay, to be trained in speaking only that is very essential in order to be qualified to lead his people through the wilderness. Such a great multitude of people to lead through this wilderness. God wanted him to train how to be silent, how to use less words, how to control his speech so that he'll be able to act properly for God and to accomplish God's plan. Okay? So, if he was prepared within that 10 years, his training would have been apt and exact. Now, he has extended another 30 years more. Understand? So, all these extra 30 years, his average speech, the word usage was less. That means by this prolonged non-usage of words, by this prolonged silence, he became slow to speech and slow of tongue. That's why I said it was an acquired deficiency. You understand what I say? If he was ready within God's time, this deficiency would not have been there. Okay? But it happened because he was not trained within the time span God has set for his training. He extended for more 30 years. That means he lost his language. He lost his capability to speak. His tongue and lips did not have much exercise, did not have much movement other than just making some special sounds to control his flock. Eventually, he became a person of stammering tongue, a person of slow speech, a person of slow tongue. He lost the vocabulary. He lost the practice of speaking because of his extension of time. Okay? So it was an acquired deficiency, not a natural deficiency. So we have the third lesson and let's conclude here. If we delay in equipping ourselves for accomplishing God's will in our life, it may spoil some capabilities God has given us for accomplishing His will. You understand what I say? If we delay in getting equipped ourselves for accomplishing God's will in our life, we may spoil, we may damage some capabilities God has given us for accomplishing His will. This is exactly what happened to Moses. God has given a proper working tongue, a good speech, but he did not use that for extra 30 years. So he lost that capability. He damaged that by his delay in getting trained. So if we delay in equipping ourselves for accomplishing God's will in our life, it may spoil, it may damage some capabilities, some faculties God has given us for accomplishing his will. This is exactly what happened in the life of Moses, and what he says, he became a man of slow speech, slow tongue. That was an acquired deficiency because of the extended time. So we will look to the 3 lessons that we learned today and conclude. Lesson 1, in spite of our knowledge and ability concerning the will of God in our life, God can accomplish it through us only when we are prepared to assigned for it. So it is very essential for us to be prepared before God so that God can assign us for accomplishing God's will in our life. As I mentioned earlier, God has a wonderful plan for our life, but God cannot accomplish it unless we are prepared, unless we prove ourselves that we are prepared to be assigned for that. So maybe we have our knowledge of the calling, maybe we have our abilities to accomplish it, but if we are not prepared before God, God cannot use us. So let's be prepared before God that God can use us in His time. Lesson 2, our failures to go to God's presence will delay the accomplishment of God's will in our life. We can delay fulfilling God's will in our life if we delay in going to the presence of God. If we do not spend time before God, if we do not seek God's assistance, God's counsel to accomplish God's plan in our life, God cannot accomplish His will in our life. So our failure, our slothfulness, our indifference to go to God's presence, maybe by any reason, eventually it will delay accomplishment of God's will in our life. We will be held responsible for that. We will be held responsible for that, dear brothers and sisters. So let's go to the God's presence. Let's be in God's presence to hear His advice, to hear His counsel, to be equipped for His mission. Lesson 3, if we delay in equipping ourselves for accomplishing God's will in our life, we may spoil some capabilities God has given us to accomplish His will. Yes, God has given us natural abilities plus spiritual gifts and the abilities that we acquired, we trained, we gathered. Still, if we delay in preparing ourselves for the mission, time will spoil those special faculties God has given us to accomplish His will in our life. So it is very crucial for us to be prepared for fulfilling God's will in our life in God's time, dear ones, that we may not spoil much of the facilities, much of the special capacities, special abilities God has given us to accomplish His will in our life. Oh, let's search our life and see. Let's compare our life with these 3 lessons and let's find out where we lack and let's make it up in God's presence that God may be pleased in our life and God may be able to accomplish His will in our life in His time, in His pleasure. May the Lord bless us with these words. May His name be glorified. Thank you.